Hello, it's John Heaton, and I've just got back from London. I was there for a few days, and on the Monday, I had a spare day on the Monday, and I thought I would go around some of the Beatles sites in London. Ended up not doing that, ended up going to Battersea Power Station, doing a bit of a Pink Floyd pilgrimage, which was quite fun. But whilst I was in London, I rediscovered this book, which I'd bought for my son when he was at university in London recently, called The Beatles Guide to the Beatles London by Richard Porter. And I kind of reread it and discovered, I'm not sure if I'd read it all the way through, I'd probably just flicked through it, but I discovered a lot of good things in here. And I want to talk about some of those things I discovered. And also, in case you didn't know, Richard Porter does Beatles tours several times a week. I think one of them leaves from Tottenham Court Road station, and we're talking about a couple of hour walking tour around the sites of the West End associated with the Beatles. And then there's another one which he does which starts at Marylebone and takes in all the Beatles sites around there, including Baker Street, and then they hop on the tube to St John's Wood and cover Abbey Road. So I haven't actually been on one of these tours, but I have actually, when I was in Montague Square quite recently, his tour happened to be coming by, so I've seen him in action, and one of these days I'll go on his tour. But anyway, in the meantime, I've got his book, and it's pretty similar in a way to that book, that superb book which came out the other year, a few years ago, called The Beatles London, with the Abbey Road picture on the front, written by Mark Lewison and a couple of other guys. I would say that this book is a nice companion to that, and there are things in either book which you won't find in the other, so I think it's worth having both. I think this one cost me £8 at the Abbey Road shop. I think I bought it, or perhaps it was there's a coffee shop right by the St John's Wood tube station which Richard Porter owns. Possibly I bought it there, but I think it's still in print. It was originally printed in 2000, and this is I think it's the 5th reprint from 2015. So it's still going strong. I don't know whether it's still in print, but it's called The Guide to the Beatles London by Richard Porter. So look it up, and if you get a copy, I thoroughly recommend it. So I want to start off by saying Kenny Everett is interviewed for this book. Very amusing stuff from him. Bill Harry, Keith Badman, the author of that superb Beatles Apart sort of day-by-day diary. Not too many other people interviewed, but, you know, Richard Porter's got a lot of personal snaps of him and Paul McCartney together, him and George Martin together. He's been following around Paul and George and Ringo since about 1982, I think, which is a lot longer than me. And he still lives in England, so he's better placed to follow them and attend various concerts over the years, and that's all documented in the book. So it's a nice personal touch, and you can tell it's written by a fan. And I like the way he uses exclamation marks to emphasize certain points. So it reminds me a bit of the Carol Bedford book, Waiting for the Beatles, which was also written by a fan, one of the Apple Scruffs, no less. So I just thought I'd say that's what probably marks it as different from being from the Mark Lewison Beatles Abbey Road picture, Beatles London Abbey Road book from Mark Lewison. Yeah. So several pictures, as I say, with Paul in particular, and there's a very interesting postcard reproduced here, which is quite small, I don't know if you can see that, of an apple with legs running, and is basically announcing that the Beatles had moved to 3 Savile Row. I thought that was very interesting. And the book is full of sort of, you know, colour pictures of Paul outside Abbey Road here, and I'm not sure if I can find one of the others, but there's a picture of George outside some cinema. There's a John at his Weybridge home. So I think he got some people to send him some pictures. There's a picture of Ringo at the Broad Street premiere, I seem to remember, and colour pictures of, this is the Asprey shop where they filmed, the jeweller's shop, where they filmed For Help, for example. So nicely illustrated, and the paperback writer video from Chiswick House, some nice pictures there, which you can go and visit as well. Actually, one thing this book doesn't cover is a lot of the locations for the Mad Day Out, despite July 28th, 1968, in case you didn't know, the Beatles went around London and had their photo taken in several different locations, including this one by the river in Wapping, which is on the front cover, but doesn't feature in the book. And I guess that's why. Because it's a long way out of your way. And if you want to take in Wapping, as well as St Pancras Gardens and all the other locations they went to, you're talking basically take up the whole day, I think, because on that July 28th mad day out, they were driven around in cars from various locations and they weren't particularly close to each other. So I guess that's the reason he's left that out, and he's based his locations on the actual tour that he does in London to this day. Because I saw him not more than a year or two ago in action on one of his tours. So what a few stories. I mean, I thought it was getting to the stage now where I couldn't learn new stuff about the Beatles, but I'm discovering new stuff from recent books that have come out, and it's great. It's a joy. So I knew that Paul had built a replica of EMI Studio Number 2 below in the basement of Soho Square, MPL offices, but I didn't know that they were when they were building that tube line cross rail a few years ago. They wanted to tunnel beneath Soho Square, and Paul McCartney was complaining that it would disturb him in this studio, but he didn't manage to win the argument there. Having said that, I don't think he uses replica studios a great deal these days, so it might just have been a symbolic gesture. Anyway, it's also, MPL is covered, and a lot of the solo venues are covered in this book, which are less covered in the Mark Lewison book. For example, MPL, Richard Porter gives you superb detail, which in this case I knew, but Paul McCartney's personal office in the MPL building is the third big window up. And in the window, if you look very carefully, you can see the statuette from the cover of Wings Greatest, with the angel with wings. So lovely detail like that. And I didn't know that in 1997, after the release of Flaming Pie, Paul had done a couple of songs on the roof of MPL. He did Young Boy and The World Tonight. Didn't know that. The Trident Studios, where George recorded All Things Must Pass and the Beatles recorded Hey Jude and a few songs for the White Album, Savoy Truffle, Honey Pie in particular. That piano eventually... It was 100 years old at the time when the Beatles used it, and then it was famously used for the Ziggy Stardust David Bowie album and the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road Elton John album. And then something went wrong with the tuning and it wasn't so good, but anyway, it still sold for £30,000. And Richard Porter rather amusingly says quite a lot of money for a piano which is unplayable these days. Bohemian Rhapsody also recorded on the same piano, so it's a pretty historic piano. There's the story of the London Palladium where the Beatles run out the front and straight into their car and then realise it's a police car, it's not their car at all. The police won't let them in, they've got nowhere to go, and the reason for all this is because the artist's entrance is round the back and they chose to come out the front. This is where all the fans were, so that was a bit unfortunate. By the way, I only picked up one, I think it's an error in the book, where there's some guy reminiscing about the fact that Doctor Who was a big program at the time, and the idea was for the Beatles were going to get dressed up in huge Yeti costumes and do a sketch for one of their appearances. Well, unless they'd got in a time machine, the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman and the Web of Fear, which featured the Yeti in Doctor Who, didn't turn up until 1967, 1968, and they were talking about a possible sketch from 1964, so it doesn't quite add up. But anyway, I thought it was interesting because I'm always looking for a link between Doctor Who and the Beatles. I nearly found one there. We've got an interesting interview from Paul McCartney from 1968, which I'd never heard. He's trying to explain how the atmosphere of Apple in his 68 interview. The idea of Apple is that even if you were a clerk in an Apple office or in anything to do with Apple, we really do try to turn you on. There is a definite effort to turn on in this building. The people who don't want it, who don't like it, will go back to being hired clerks because they'd rather do that. But if you want to come here in order to be sort of turned on clerk, that's great. I think occasionally too much of it goes on and you don't get much work done because everyone's so busy turning each other on. But it is nicer. I mean, it really is a different atmosphere in this place from any building I've ever been in. So that's kind of from the kind of early days of Apple, when it was still quite an innocent place, I guess. And then Derek Taylor is also talking about Apple the same year, saying Apple is an organization that has developed without anyone really planning it this way. It's a service that exists to implement the whims of the Beatles, which fortunately do normally turn out to be commercial. However, if they didn't, we'd still have to do it. And that's okay, because that's the gig. The gig is not Apple. The gig is working for the Beatles. So a lovely comment from Derek Taylor there. What else have we got? Alan Parsons describing what a joke Magic Alex's attempted studio was in the basement of Apple during the Get Back sessions, saying it was put together with chewing gum and all the nails were crooked, and that's quite an amusing bit. And then he had to go, because they were preparing for the rooftop concert, because of the wind, they were worried about the microphones getting distorted with the vocals. So Alan Parsons was dispatched off to Marks and Spencer's to buy some stockings, and he went up to the lingerie department and asked for some stockings. They said, "What size? Doesn't matter." "What colour?" "Doesn't matter." And he said, "I think they thought I was really odd." So that was a funny story. What else have we got? The policeman who came to shut down the rooftop concert is by the name of Ken Wharf and his mate. They were both Beatles fans, and Richard Porter said they had no intention of closing down the concert at all. Which, if you watch the film, it's pretty true. They don't much of an effort. They let them finish the set, more or less. And then, of course, it became an Abercrombie kids shop, which I visited a few years ago. I think it's no longer that now. Then we've got Prince of Wales Theatre on Coventry Street. And a lot of these locations you might remember from if you've ever played the game Monopoly. It's got a lot of these locations as kind of stops on the way around the board, and Coventry Street is one of them. I seem to remember one of the yellow ones. And then apparently John Lennon, instead of saying "rattle your jewellery" during that Royal Command performance, was going to say "rattle your effing jewellery." And Richard Porter said it's a good job he didn't, because if they'd used that word in front of the royal family, that would have been the end of the Beatles' career. The London Pavilion hosted the premiere of A Hard Day's Night, Help, Yellow Submarine, and Let It Be. And that, I didn't realise it was that building right in the middle of Piccadilly. I think it's now I can't remember the name of the shop. He did say what it was now, but I remember for years, in the 80s and 90s perhaps, it was Tower Records, that same building. But back in the day, it was a cinema, and those 4 premieres were there. Fortnum and Mason. There's a department store, as mentioned here, a very expensive department store where Apple used to buy all their groceries from. And Richard amusingly says this is a good example of how extravagant Apple was, that just for normal groceries, they'd go to somewhere which would charge 10 times the price of anywhere else. So much good stuff in here. Indica Gallery. I didn't know that on the 40th anniversary of John and Yoko meeting at the Indica Gallery, Sean Lennon did a concert at the nearby church with Yoko in attendance, St James's Church, I think it was. Never knew that. Asprey's the jewellers I mentioned earlier. John saw some fans coming on the street and rushed into Asprey's and then disappeared around the back. And he was only in the shop for 30 seconds, but managed to spend £600, which in today's money is about £10,000. Hilarious. Managed to square where they did the red and the blue cover, obviously, and the Please Please Me cover. And a lot of groups were asked to take their picture on the same balcony, and only 2 groups were allowed, Sex Pistols and Blur. So that was interesting. Victor Spinetti, the fact that there was a memorial service for him in 2012, and Paul gave an amusing speech. The Jane Asher's family residence, 57 Wimpole Street, to avoid the fans, there was an elaborate escape route out the back, which Paul had to climb over the roof and into the neighbour's house. And there were some girls reminiscing in this book who met Paul just outside Wimpole Street, and he basically told them to sod off. And they were quite upset, but then a few minutes later, when they were sodding off down the road, they realised that Paul McCartney had been speaking to them, and regardless of what he said, it was pretty memorable. So they went and told all their friends about it, and they're still telling people to this day, no doubt. Mrs. Asher tried to teach Paul the piano, but he gave up after a few lessons. But she did earlier teach a young George Martin the oboe, and what else? Yeah, managed to teach Paul the recorder. And Dr. Asher, Jane's father, just when the post office tower was being opened, lovely detail in this book, as I said, just phoned up the post office tower and said, "Do you mind if I bring my family round?" I think he must have been quite a distinguished guy in London or something. "Do you mind if I bring my family round to see the new building?" So they said, okay. And he turned up with Peter and Jane Asher and Paul McCartney. So Peter was a member of Peter and Gordon, the famous singing duo of the 60s. Jane Asher was a famous actress. And Paul McCartney was obviously about the most famous musician on the planet at the time. So that was quite an amusing story. Quite a few stories about the Apple shop. Apparently, Alistair Taylor had an idea to open a card shop, and he says they're on every shop corner these days, those shops selling birthday cards. But Lennon's reaction was quite memorable. He said, "What an effing boring idea." So that one got dropped. When the Apple shop did open, it famously sold psychedelic clothes, but Alec's psychedelic lighting made the security impossible and made it a shoplifter's paradise. So people, I think it's Pete Shotton was saying stuff was disappearing off the shelves faster than we could replace them, but without the benefit of a cash transaction. So basically people were nicking stuff and the staff were too scared to sort of collar anyone who was shoplifting, and then were stealing stuff themselves. There's another story of Ringo and one of the girls in the shop were walking down the steps of the shop, and they realised they were doing it in time a la Your Mother Should Know from Mystery Tour, so they started singing it together, and Ringo danced her down the steps. I thought it was a delightful story. Marylebone railway station, apparently George falling over in the beginning of Hard Day's Night, that was an accident, that really happened. George actually did hurt himself, and Dick Lester thought it was so good he left it in. A Hard Day's Night, Richard Porter was involved in the DVD reconstruction in the early 2000s, and he was always wondering why there was a solo bit for John in the movie, a solo bit for George, and a solo bit for Ringo, but no solo bit for Paul. And but apparently there was a solo bit for Paul, and it was shot, but it was cut from the film because I don't know how you pronounce her name, Isla Blair, was wearing a kind of low-cut dress, and Paul McCartney was kind of looking at her cleavage instead of looking where he was supposed to be looking, so that got cut. That was an interesting story. Brian's house in Chapel Street, Belgravia, Kenny Everett rather funnily says the Beatles were photographed in front of a huge fireplace, but they couldn't string a sentence together because they were so stoned. So you don't get that kind of detail in the Lewison book, do you? So the towpath at Kew, where Ringo did his solo walking along the Thames with the boy, that's a photograph of that in this book. And there's also the pub, I think it's called the City Barge, which is on the river, or they at least filmed the exterior scenes there on the river. John's house in Weybridge on the private estate, St George's Hill, there was a story about Kenny Everett was told the story of a fan. Someone's at the door, a fan's at the door to see John, and John instead of telling them to get lost, went out, chatted to this girl for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then politely ushered her out of the property. And Kenny Everett was saying, I thought that was quite sweet because he could have let one of the dogs on her or shot her or something. And he just chatted to her instead. So that was a nice story. So I got a lot out of this book. I want to congratulate Richard Porter on this book and also the tours he does in London, which by all accounts are brilliant. I will go on them one of these days. I'm always learning stuff. It's great. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.